This module is on innovation models, and I want to point out before we start that this slide set was adapted from a quick guide to innovation by Peter Denning on a short course that he runs, which is based on his recent book called The Innovator's Way. I'll give you the reference at the end of these slides, so that's a highly recommended book for you. But just going to sort of walk you through this idea. Now think about this before we get started, that invention and innovation are not the same thing. Invention is the creation of some new idea. Lots of inventions happen all the time that don't impact our world at all. For innovation to actually happen, the invention must be adopted. So Dr. Denning talks a lot about adoption, which is a practice. So he's going to talk about 8 practices that are necessary to bring about a culture of adoption. So let's get into it. So he starts by talking about the 2 schools of thought about innovation. One is called ideation and the other is called adoption. In ideation, it's about the idea. The idea is the central part. So things like creativity and imagination drive the ideas, which then make their way into the markets. And along the way, we have to deal with things like research and development, prototyping, manufacturing, marketing, publications and media, tools, education and training, and new businesses. And it's sort of like this black box. The important part is the idea, and good ideas will find their way into the marketplace. The adoption school doesn't buy that. What they talk about is that you've got ideas, so the creation of new ideas, and it's very important that they have value. Ideas with no value will never be adopted. There will never be a business case for them. So the ideas are the what, and then there's this practice side, which is the how. How do you turn this thing into a product? How do you make it so people will use it? And so the real desired outcome is that the adoption of a new practice in a community. And if you think to yourself, well, we're not talking about adoption of a practice. I'm talking about adoption of a new technology or a new widget that I have. Well, I would argue that that is adoption of a new practice. If you have a new technology that you want some new industry or an old industry to adopt, you're asking them to change their practice and use the new technology. So it's about practice. Now this slide gives you your first introduction to the 8 practices, and we're going to have one more slide to talk about them in more detail, but let me give you a little rough around what they all are. Is first you've got a couple that are focused on invention. They're the gray ones. So sensing, that's like kind of knowing your environment, knowing where the problems are, where are the opportunities for improvement, just getting the idea. The second is envisioning, being able to tell the right story and say, hey, I know how to do this. I know how to build something that will fill that niche. Next, following around the circle, is offering. It's the offering of, hey, I've got this thing, and going to an industry and saying, hey, here's what you should do. You should adopt this, and this is why you should do it. It's being able to make a business case and convince people that they ought to consider adopting, which is, of course, the next practice, which is the actual adoption. Okay, we'll give it a try. This is what we're going to do. We're going to pilot test it. We're going to measure it this way. This is what we're going to do. Come around to number 5 is sustaining. It doesn't matter if they've tried adopting it. If you don't stick with it and it doesn't work well, and prove to the company or the industry that this is a good thing to do and that this is a transforming innovation, they're not going to stick with it. So they have to sustain it. And then inside of it are these 3 interaction practices having to do with executing, that's building your team and doing it right, good leadership, and this last thing we call embodying, which is sort of, you might think of this as sort of like the Uber practice over the whole thing of sort of changing the culture of the organization to be one of adoption and the changing of the culture. And all of these are essential. You can't get away from any of them. You can't cut one of these out and have a successful adoption of an innovation. So a little more on the 8 practices in terms of what the practices are and what does a breakdown in that practice actually look like. So with sensing, we're talking about having a blindness to the problem or a lack of creativity. With envisioning, that would be just a lack of imagination or an inability to tell the story, an inability to see how you go from the problem to a product or a solution. In offering, we talk about, I mean, what if the offer just isn't credible? There's no business case behind it. You can't sell this idea because it's not credible, or there's too much risk involved. Adopting would be about a resistance to it. You're changing the culture here. I don't want to do that. Or there's too few early adopters. In this company, there aren't enough people who are even going to try this thing you're proposing. Sustaining would have to do with, it doesn't really integrate with our current practices or our current products, or a lack of leadership commitment. Executing might talk about, you don't have the right team members, you don't have the right coordination in your team. Leading would have to do with having coercive leading. The leader says, we will adopt this, therefore you will adopt this. Never succeeds. Or a lack of real care. Like, leadership really passionately cares about this. That's why we're doing it. It's not because they're just forcing it on us. And then lastly, embodying is an inability to blend this with the culture of the organization, having an insensitivity to the mood and emotion of the company. Are people excited about this? Are they fighting us? Are you changing the culture or aren't you? So where is the balance? And this is why ideation is probably not the way to go, is that the idea is only like 11% of the problem. The practices are the tough part. So we're not trying to say that invention is simple. Nobody's saying that. Invention is hard. But invention without attention to the practices of innovation adoption gets us nowhere. That's the point. So a few traps you can fall into that you want to be aware of is first the invention myth is that creativity and imagination and the guys who invent things, that's the driver. That's what really is going to make this successful. It's not unimportant, but it in and of itself is not going to reach the goal. The leadership myth is that management and leadership, having that vision, having that Steve Jobs type guy who's got this vision of the future, that's the most important thing. Well, he wasn't the most technical guy in the company. No leader that you can think of that is successful in innovating an industry has all the skill sets. He's surrounded by great people. So management and leadership are not always the most important drivers. They're also essential, but not sufficient. Lastly is the performance myth. So good ideas confer capability for effective action. So it's just a matter of performance. It's a matter of being able to pull this thing off. Well, that's not it either, because if you don't have the good idea, you don't have the leadership, then you're not going to pull it off. You need all of these things. So some critical distinctions behind the ideas side and the practices side is that ideas are about first of all, they're in language. It's how we talk. Mental models, rules, procedures, and processes. We talk about how things work. And I can talk to you about that. Practice is necessarily performance. It's the doing of things. It's an action. It's the way we do things. It's the way we automatize things. It's the skill sets that we bring to bear on our problems. That's what practices are all about. Okay, so that was just a very quick snapshot. I highly recommend the book. It's excellent. And it's interesting because so many books have been written about innovation, and not very many of them really talk about how you do it. Great to talk about innovation. You can look at different models from different industries, but what good would it do to talk to you about a model of innovation from the automotive industry or the pharmaceutical industry and sort of leave it to your imagination to how to translate that into medical simulation or military simulation or whatever we happen to be interested in. More importantly, talk about the processes and the practices of making innovation work so that it is much clearer how to embrace those practices and bring them into your organization.